You've probably lost your way somewhere before. A wrong turn, a missed exit. Maybe you kept driving for a few extra minutes before you realized your mistake and turned around. Now imagine you can't turn around. Imagine the wrong turn lasts 2 hours, at night, over a landscape with no lights, no landmarks, and no way to know you're wrong until the fuel runs out. That's not a thought experiment. That's exactly what happened to 9 young men on the night of April 4th, 1943. But the real story isn't just about how they got lost. It's about what happened after, and what a piece of paper found in the dead man's pocket would eventually reveal to the entire world. Here's what actually happened. Here's what the evidence says. And here's why it still matters today. The aircraft was a B-24D Liberator bomber, nicknamed Lady Be Good. She was brand new, assigned to the 514th Bomb Squadron of the United States Army Air Forces just 10 days earlier. Her crew was new too. 9 young airmen, most in their early 20s, flying their very first combat mission together. Pilot William Hatton, co-pilot Robert Toner, navigator Deep Hayes. 5 more men behind them, each with a specific job, each trusting the others to do theirs. Their mission that night was a bombing run over Naples, Italy, launched from an airbase called Soluch on the coast of Libya. It should have been routine. It was anything but. The weather over the target was bad. Visibility was poor. By the time Lady Be Good reached Naples, most of the formation had already turned back or scattered. Hatton's crew pressed on anyway, dropped their bombs on a secondary target, and turned for home, alone, in the dark. Being alone in the sky at night isn't just lonely, it's dangerous. There's no one else to check your instruments against, no one else to notice if something feels wrong. And something was about to go very wrong. As the aircraft approached the Libyan coast sometime after midnight, the base at Soluch fired flares to help guide returning planes home. Lady Be Good's radio operator made contact, asking for a directional bearing. What came back, according to post-war investigation reports, was a bearing that put the base behind them, not ahead. Whether it was a bad reading or bad luck, the effect was the same. The crew believed they hadn't yet reached the coastline. In reality, they had already flown past it. Question: what do you do when every instrument you trust is quietly, invisibly wrong? You keep flying the direction you believe is correct. That's exactly what Hatton's crew did. They flew on, out over what they assumed was still the Mediterranean Sea, waiting to spot the coastline below. But the coastline never came, because they'd already crossed it. They weren't over water anymore. They were flying deep into the Sahara Desert, hundreds of miles past their base, into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. For nearly 2 more hours, they flew on. 2 hours of a 9-man crew slowly running out of fuel over a desert they didn't know they were in. Around 2 in the morning, the engines began to sputter. There was no more room for error, no runway, no safe place to land. Hatton gave the order to bail out. One by one, 8 men jumped into the darkness, parachutes opening above sand dunes none of them had ever seen. The 9th man, engineer Harold Ripslinger, jumped last. The plane itself, empty now, flew on without them, gliding for another 16 miles before finally settling gently onto the desert floor, its landing gears still up, its guns still loaded, remarkably intact. A search was launched when Lady Be Good failed to return. Search planes scanned the Mediterranean coastline and the waters beyond it, because that's where everyone assumed the crew had gone down. No one thought to look inland. Why would they? No bomber crew was supposed to be 200 miles into the Sahara. The search came up empty, and eventually the Army Air Forces did what military records required. They marked the crew as missing, presumed lost at sea. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. On the ground, the 8 surviving crew members had landed within a few miles of each other in the dark. By morning, they'd found one another, all except Ripslinger, who jumped later and landed farther away. 8 men, No water beyond a single canteen each, no idea how far they were from anything, standing in a desert that can reach temperatures hot enough to blister skin during the day and freeze at night. They made a decision that, in hindsight, sealed their fate. They believed they had gone down near the coast, so they started walking north toward where they thought the Mediterranean Sea would be. In reality, they were roughly 440 miles inland. North was, by a staggering margin, the wrong direction to walk if speed mattered, though there was no direction that could have saved them at that distance without water. They walked for days. Co-pilot Robert Toner carried a small notebook, and in it he recorded what was happening to his crew almost every day, in short, plain sentences. Historian and independent researcher Dennis P. Martinez, who has spent decades studying and documenting the case, has described Toner's diary as one of the most complete, first-hand accounts of a World War II survival ordeal ever recovered. It wasn't dramatic writing, it was just true. The entries describe the men rationing sips of water, walking at night to avoid the worst heat, resting in whatever shade a rock or a dune could offer during the day, their strength failing a little more with each passing day. By April 11th, 7 days after bailing out, the entries grow shorter, simpler. The men had walked an estimated 78 miles across open desert, on foot, with almost no water, which by any survival standard should not have been possible. And still, it wasn't enough. One man, Bombardier John Warofka, died on the first night, his parachute apparently failing to fully deploy. The rest kept walking together until eventually 5 of the men could go no further. 3 of the strongest, Guy Shelley, Vernon Moore, and Harold Ripslinger, who had rejoined the group, pressed on to try to find help for the others. None of the 8 survived. The wreckage of Lady Be Good sat undisturbed in the desert for 15 years. In November of 1958, a British oil survey team flying over the region spotted something unusual glinting on the sand. It was the fuselage of a large aircraft sitting almost exactly where it had glided to a stop back in 1943. When ground crews finally reached it in 1959, what they found stunned them. The dry desert air had acted like a time capsule. The radio still worked. Thermos flasks still held drinkable water. Machine guns still fired when tested. But the plane was empty. The crew wasn't there. And that set off a second search, this time for the men themselves. Over the following 2 years, recovery teams combed the surrounding desert, guided in part by Toner's diary and by the physical trail the men had left behind: discarded boots, a life vest used as a makeshift sled, scattered gear marking their route. Captain Myron Fuller and searcher Wesley Neep led some of the final recovery missions in 1960, ultimately locating the remains of 8 of the 9 crew members. Ripslinger's body was never found. Here's the detail that stops people cold when they hear this story for the first time. The men had walked farther, on less water, than most survival experts of the era believed was physically possible. Later analysis of Toner's diary by military researchers found that the crew's discipline, rationing tiny amounts of water and moving mostly at night, likely extended their survival window by days beyond what raw physiology alone would predict. They didn't fail because they gave up. They failed because the math of the desert simply didn't have enough water in it, no matter how disciplined they were. So why does a 70-year-old bomber crash still get millions of views, still get retold in documentaries and museum exhibits, still unsettle people scrolling through their phones today? Because it isn't really a story about a plane. It's a story about how a small, invisible error, one wrong number on one radio transmission, can quietly compound into something catastrophic, while everyone involved is doing everything they believe is right. The crew didn't panic. They didn't make reckless choices. They followed their training, trusted their instruments, and made a series of individually reasonable decisions that added up to tragedy. You felt a smaller version of this, a wrong assumption at work that snowballs for weeks before anyone notices, A miscommunication in a relationship that quietly steers two people in opposite directions while both believe they're heading the same way. The scale is different. The mechanism is exactly the same. Small errors, trusted completely, can carry you a very long way from where you meant to go before the truth catches up. The crew of Lady Be Good believed they were flying over the sea, right up until they ran out of the ability to believe anything else. And by the time the truth became undeniable, there was no fuel left to fix it. That's the part of this story that isn't really about 1943 at all. It's about how easily any of us can be flying confidently in the wrong direction and not know it until the moment we're forced to look down and see exactly where we really are.